So listen, I need to tell you something that's gonna sound completely crazy, but everyone in my life has literally lost their minds over nothing. I'm Sadie, I'm 22, and apparently making smart financial decisions makes you the worst person alive, according to my ex-boyfriend and my own father. I was with Weston for 2.5 years. He's 21, works some basic office job, and honestly, looking back, I should have seen how controlling he was going to be. We were talking about moving in together, making all these future plans, and I really believed we wanted the same things. Weston's one of those guys who follows every single rule, never takes risks, thinks the world runs on some perfect moral code that doesn't exist. Here's the thing though. He had his stable little job that paid decent money while I'm busting my butt as a full-time student working retail that barely covers gas money. I've always been super independent, hate asking for help, especially hate feeling like I owe someone something. When Weston offered to help with money, I always said no, because I wasn't raised to be some kept woman waiting for a man to solve my problems. The money situation got really bad junior year. Maxed out credit cards, behind on car payments, choosing between gas and groceries every week. I couldn't afford textbooks, my car was making weird noises I couldn't fix, constantly stressed about money while watching other girls at school with endless spending money for whatever they wanted. That's when I started researching different ways to make real money online. Not stupid surveys or delivery apps that pay $5 an hour, but actual money. I found out dancers at local clubs were making hundreds in a single night. More money in one weekend than I made in a month at retail. It seemed like the obvious solution. I've always known I was attractive, not being conceited, just factual. Men have been paying attention since I was probably too young, and I learned early how to use that smart. Getting better tips at work, getting out of speeding tickets, normal stuff. Why wouldn't I use what I had to solve my financial problems? The more I researched, the more sense it made. These girls worked 3 or 4 nights a week, making more than people with college degrees. They were independent, confident, financially secure. Meanwhile, I'm struggling for basic necessities while my boyfriend lives comfortably in his little stability bubble. One night, when we were watching Netflix, I decided to test the waters. Brought it up super casual, just mentioning how some girls at school were doing it and making really good money. Not saying I was thinking about it, just making conversation about how crazy it was people could make that much so easily. His reaction was immediate and completely over the top. Looked at me like I suggested robbing a bank. Told me flat out if I ever went down that road, he couldn't stay with me. Not, I'd prefer if you didn't, but straight up, I would leave you. Like, who says that to someone they supposedly love? I was honestly shocked by how controlling and judgmental he was being. Here I am struggling financially, trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and instead of being supportive, he's giving me ultimatums about what I can do with my own body. It felt really manipulative and possessive, like he thought he owned me. Of course, I told him I understood and wouldn't actually do it. What else was I supposed to say? But his reaction just proved he didn't really understand or respect my independence. He was more concerned about his own insecurities than my actual well-being or financial stress. In my head, I was already thinking how ridiculous his reaction was. It's literally just dancing. It's not like I was talking about anything actually inappropriate. These men pay to look at women dance, and honestly, they're the pathetic ones. I'd be the one in control, making money off their desperation. If anything, I'd be taking advantage of them. I started looking up local clubs online, reading reviews, checking websites. There was this one place that seemed really professional and upscale, not some sketchy dive. The girls in photos looked confident and successful, not desperate like movie stereotypes. These were smart women making smart financial decisions. The more I thought about it, what Weston didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I could do this temporarily, just until I caught up on bills and saved for next semester. Solve all my problems without anyone knowing or being affected. Keep my relationship and financial independence at the same time. I convinced myself Weston was just being dramatic and insecure. Most guys probably react that way initially, but get over it when they realize it's not a big deal. Or better yet, They never know in the first place. I figured I was smart enough to manage both parts of my life without them intersecting. Getting the job was easier than expected. Went to audition on a Tuesday when I told Weston I was studying at the library. Had researched what to wear, how to present myself, what to expect. Wasn't nervous because I knew I had what they wanted. Tony, the manager, was actually really professional and businesslike. Explained schedule, house rules, payment structure, everything clearly. Wasn't sketchy or gross like I worried. Other girls seemed normal and confident, not damaged like stereotypes. They were making real money and seemed to enjoy their work. I was immediately impressed by how much money the girls made, more in one good night than 2 weeks at retail. Simple math. Work 3 nights a week and make more than my current job while having more time for school. Like I found this secret world of financial opportunity most people were too judgmental or scared to access. I started that same week, created a whole system to cover tracks because I needed to be smart about managing both lives. Told Weston my retail job offered extra evening and weekend shifts because they were short-staffed. Deleted the club's contact info and saved Tony's number under a fake name. Opened separate bank account for dancing money. Just being organized and professional. Honestly, I was pretty proud of how well I managed the deception. Had answers for everything. Why I was tired, working late, couldn't hang out certain nights. Created fake stories about retail coworkers and drama to make lies more believable. Careful about schedule, appearance, everything. The money and attention immediately changed everything. Having men compete for my attention, throw money at me, treat me like the most desirable woman in the room was incredibly empowering. First time in my adult life I felt complete control of my financial situation. Wasn't stressed about bills, choosing between necessities, could actually afford to live normal. But it was more than money. The confidence I felt at work affected other parts of life. Felt more attractive, powerful, aware of my worth. Started buying clothes that actually fit well. Getting hair and nails done regularly. Taking better care of myself because I could finally afford to. When Weston noticed I told him about sales and tip money from retail. The attention from customers was addictive in ways I hadn't expected. These weren't broke college guys. Some were successful businessmen, professionals, guys who clearly had money and status. They treated me like I was special, worth their time and money. Made me start looking at my relationship with Weston differently. Weston seemed so boring and predictable compared to work-life excitement. He had his little routine, modest goals, simple pleasures. Meanwhile, I'm meeting men who drove expensive cars, wore designer suits, could afford to spend more in one night than Weston probably made in a week. Started noticing things about him that annoyed me. His clothes weren't stylish, car was embarrassing, ambitions were limited. Found myself becoming more critical, without meaning to. When he'd talk about his day or weekend plans, it all seemed small and unimportant compared to what I was experiencing. I was making real money, meeting successful people, living this exciting double life he couldn't imagine. Sometimes felt bad about feeling superior, but couldn't help noticing how different our worlds had become. The lies got more elaborate, but I was good at it. When Weston asked more questions about my schedule or sudden financial improvement, I had explanations ready. Told him I got promoted to shift supervisor with better pay. Even found fake pay stubs online to show him when he seemed suspicious about how much my situation improved. When he brought up looking for apartments together since I was doing so well financially, I panicked a little. Moving in would make it much harder to maintain schedule and privacy. Made excuses about wanting to wait until after graduation, being more financially stable first, not rushing such a big step. He seemed disappointed, but accepted my reasoning. Truth was, I was starting to enjoy having this secret life that belonged only to me. At the club, I was confident, successful, desired, in control. At home with Weston, I was just his girlfriend, who was supposed to be grateful for his stability and basic affection. The contrast made me realize how much I'd been settling for. There was this one regular customer I started looking forward to seeing. Businessman who always wore expensive suits and tipped really well. Probably in his 40s, clearly successful, always requested private dances with me. We'd talk during slower moments, and he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person, not just entertainment. I told myself being friendly with customers was just good business, but I was definitely developing feelings. He represented everything Weston wasn't. Financially successful, confident, worldly, generous. When he'd compliment me or tell me I was special, it felt more meaningful than anything Weston ever said. Started staying after shifts, sometimes to have drinks with him when the club was closing. Told Weston I had to do inventory or cleaning duties. Those conversations felt more real and exciting than most time I spent with my actual boyfriend. Was starting to fantasize about dating someone who could actually provide the lifestyle I was getting used to. The emotional manipulation with Weston started happening without me planning it. When he'd express concern about our growing distance, I'd flip it around and make him feel clingy and insecure. Tell him he was being paranoid when he noticed changes in my behavior. When he'd ask about work schedule or spending habits, I'd make him feel guilty for not trusting me. Developed this habit of using his insecurities against him during arguments. He was always worried about not being able to provide for me financially, so I'd make subtle comments about how he wouldn't understand business decisions or money management. Use phrases like, "when you're more mature," or "if you really trusted me," to shut down conversations I didn't want. Looking back, I think I was already mentally checked out of the relationship, but too comfortable to actually break up. Liked having Weston as emotional support and stability while getting excitement and validation from work. Thought I was managing everything perfectly, keeping both worlds separate and getting the best of both. In my mind, I was just being smart and taking advantage of opportunities other people were too judgmental or scared to pursue. Wasn't hurting anyone, was solving my financial problems, discovering this whole side of myself I never knew existed. If Weston couldn't handle me being independent and successful, that was his problem. The night everything fell apart started like any other shift. Feeling confident and in control, making excellent money, enjoying attention from regulars. Had completely settled into routine and wasn't worried about anything. Been doing this several months without problems, felt like I had everything under control. Was actually annoyed when Weston texted during work hours because I saw his messages as interruptions to my real job. Had gotten used to compartmentalizing my two lives so completely that his attempts to check in felt intrusive and possessive. Making more money than he probably realized, and was tired of pretending to care about his boring daily updates. That's when Dylan showed up. Dylan was one of Weston's friends, there for some bachelor party thing. Moment I saw him walk in, I felt panic, but convinced myself I could handle it. Was wearing different makeup, hair styled completely different, lighting was dim. Figured good chance he wouldn't recognize me. When our eyes met across the room, I knew he'd spotted me, but tried to play it cool. In my head was already planning how to manage this. Maybe Dylan would be cool and not say anything. Maybe he'd think it was hot his friend's girlfriend was confident enough to do this. Maybe I could convince him he was mistaken if he brought it up later. But Dylan didn't approach or make a scene. Just quietly left with his group, and I thought maybe I dodged a bullet. Continued my shift normally, even feeling proud of staying calm under pressure. Told myself, even if Dylan said something to Weston, I could explain it away somehow. Had been managing this double life successfully for months, so one little hiccup wouldn't ruin everything. Had no idea Dylan immediately texted Weston with details and photos. Finished my shift feeling good about how I handled the situation. Completely unaware my entire world was about to explode. When I got home that night, I knew something was wrong the moment I walked in. Weston was sitting in the dark with his phone, completely still. The apartment felt tense, like air before a storm. Could see the text conversation with Dylan still open on his screen, and my stomach dropped when I realized what happened. He didn't yell or get dramatic like I expected. Just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen. Disappointed, disgusted, done. Told me he knew exactly where I'd been and what I'd been doing. Had photo evidence to prove it. All my carefully planned explanations suddenly seemed pathetic and useless. I tried everything to salvage the situation. First denied it completely, told him Dylan was probably drunk and confused, that it was dark, and he couldn't have gotten a clear look. When that didn't work, tried minimizing it, saying it was just one time and I was desperate for money. Then attempted to turn it around, accusing him of being controlling and judgmental for caring about something that didn't affect him. Finally tried emotional manipulation, acting hurt that he didn't trust me after everything we'd been through. Brought up all the times I'd been supportive, all the ways I'd been a good girlfriend, trying to make him feel guilty for abandoning me over something so stupid. None of it worked. He had evidence, had clearly been preparing for this conversation, wasn't falling for any of my usual tactics. The whole time he stayed calm and cold, which somehow made it worse than if he'd just screamed at me. Honestly, during that whole confrontation, I was more angry than ashamed, furious at Dylan for snitching like some tattletale child, mad at Weston for being such a judgmental baby, irritated that my careful planning had been ruined by pure bad luck. Wasn't actually sorry about what I'd been doing, only sorry I got caught. In my head, was already thinking about how I could fix this. Maybe promise to quit, even though I had no intention of giving up the money and independence I'd found. Maybe make Weston feel guilty enough about abandoning me that he'd take me back. Maybe convince him this was just temporary mistake and not who I really was. But when I looked at his face, I could tell none of those strategies would work. He looked at me like he didn't know who I was anymore, like I was a stranger wearing his girlfriend's face for months. The conversation ended with him calmly telling me it was over, and I needed to leave. Tried to argue, negotiate, buy time to come up with a better plan. But he was completely done. Said he couldn't be with someone who could lie to his face for months, manipulate and deceive him so easily, have so little respect for their relationship that she'd risk it all for money. I packed a bag that night thinking this was temporary, that he just needed time to cool off and think rationally. Figured once initial shock wore off, he'd realize what I'd done wasn't actually that big a deal and we could work things out. Had no idea I'd never be welcome in that apartment again. Drove to my dad's house expecting sympathy and support, but walked into a second confrontation I never saw coming. Apparently Weston had called my father and told him exactly what I'd been doing and why our relationship ended. Was honestly shocked he would involve my family in our private business like that. Felt like such a betrayal and invasion of my privacy. My dad was waiting in the living room, and I could tell immediately he was beyond angry. He was disgusted and ashamed, talking about how he didn't raise me to sell myself and how I'd brought shame to our family name. I tried explaining it wasn't like that I was just dancing and making smart financial decisions, but he wasn't interested in hearing my side. Attempted the same approaches that failed with Weston, playing victim, minimizing my actions, trying to make him feel guilty for not being more financially supportive during college. Reminded him how expensive school was, how much I'd been struggling, how independent I'd always tried to be. But he shut down every excuse I tried. He told me plenty of students struggle with money without resorting to what I'd done. Said there were scholarships, student loans, part-time jobs, family support available if I just asked for help instead of choosing the path I chose. Made it sound like I'd chosen the worst possible option, when really I'd chosen the smartest and most profitable one. The conversation escalated when I made the mistake of doubling down on my choices, instead of just apologizing and trying to smooth things over. Told him I was an adult who could make my own decisions, that what I'd done was just a job like any other, and that both he and Weston were being judgmental and old-fashioned. Even told him I was proud of my independence and financial success, which was clearly wrong thing to say but was also completely true. I had solved my money problems, discovered my own power and confidence, learned I didn't need to depend on anyone else to take care of me. If he couldn't see that as positive, that was his limitation. My father's response was swift and devastating. Told me if I was so independent and proud of my choices, I could be independent somewhere else. Gave me 1 hour to pack essential belongings and get out of his house. When I realized he was actually serious, tried to backtrack and apologize, but it was too late. Said his house wouldn't be used as a base of operations for what I was doing, and as long as I was making those choices, I wasn't welcome in his home. Actually changed the locks that same day, like I was some criminal, instead of his daughter trying to make it through college. Suddenly, I was homeless with nowhere to go and no support system. Tried staying with friends from school, but my roommates wanted nothing to do with the drama, especially after word started spreading about why Weston dumped me. Discovered Dylan hadn't just told Weston, he'd told his girlfriend, who told her sorority sisters, and now half the campus knew my business. Everyone was acting like I'd done something terrible, instead of recognizing I'd been smart enough to find a solution to my financial problems. The gossip and judgment felt really unfair, like people were more interested in tearing me down than understanding my situation. Felt like I was being slut-shamed for making a practical business decision. My attempts to reconnect with Weston failed completely. Showed up at his apartment, but he wouldn't even let me inside. Called and texted repeatedly, but he blocked my number. Even tried to get his friends to talk to him for me, but they all acted like I was toxic. Couldn't understand why he was being so dramatic and final about everything. In my mind, this was all temporary anger that would eventually blow over once people calmed down and started thinking rationally. Figured Weston would miss me and realize what I'd done wasn't worth throwing away our entire relationship. Thought my dad would cool off and remember I was still his daughter, regardless of choices I'd made. With nowhere else to turn, started spending more time at the club and making it my primary base of operations. Was sleeping on other dancers' couches and keeping belongings in the employee area. Told myself this was just temporary while I figured out my next move, but was also starting to enjoy the lifestyle more than I wanted to admit. The other dancers became my new social circle, and honestly, they were way more supportive and understanding than my old friends. They didn't judge me for my choices or make me feel bad about doing what I needed to survive. They got it in a way people from my old life never could. Increased my hours at the club and started making it my full-time job instead of just a side hustle. The money was still good, and I was developing a loyal customer base who appreciated me. Convinced myself this was actually better than my old life, financially independent, surrounded by people who accepted me, free from all the judgment and restrictions I'd been dealing with. In my head, I was the victim of small-minded people who couldn't handle a strong, independent woman making her own financial and life decisions. Everyone who had abandoned me was just showing their true colors and proving they'd never really supported me in the first place. Refused to see any connection between choices I'd made and consequences I was facing. Months passed and I fully embraced my new lifestyle. Moved in with 2 other dancers, started making steady money, cultivated a regular customer base. Told myself I was thriving without all the judgment and restrictions from my old life, even though I was clearly just living day to day without any real future planning or stability. Developed this hardened attitude toward relationships and started viewing men as either sources of income or temporary entertainment. Convinced myself I was smarter than other women who wasted time on emotional attachments when they could be focusing on financial security and independence. But then everything started falling apart in ways I never saw coming. Discovered that the businessman I'd been developing feelings for was married with children. The discovery happened in the worst possible way when his wife showed up at the club one night and created a massive scene. She was screaming about how he'd been lying to her, spending their family money on strippers, destroying their marriage. Police got called. Somehow local news crews showed up to cover the drama. I ended up in the background of news footage about a local family man caught in strip club scandal, and the video went viral on social media within hours. Suddenly, I wasn't anonymous anymore. The viral exposure destroyed what remained of my reputation completely. My college classmates, former coworkers, and extended family all saw the footage and recognized me. Started receiving messages from relatives expressing disappointment and shame about what I'd become. My academic advisor called me in for a meeting about how this might affect my degree prospects, since my program had a professional conduct clause. Former friends were screenshotting my appearance in the news coverage and sharing it with cruel commentary online. The humiliation was overwhelming and inescapable. But the final blow came when I learned about Weston's new life through social media. He hadn't just moved on. He'd found someone who seemed genuinely kind and supportive. She was this nursing student who volunteered at animal shelters and seemed to bring out his best qualities. The photos showed him looking happier and more confident than I'd ever seen him during our relationship. Even worse, he'd been promoted at work and appeared to be thriving in every way since cutting me out of his life. Everything about his new situation looked better than what we'd had together. His new girlfriend was prettier than me, seemed more accomplished, and clearly appreciated him in ways I never had. My attempts to rebuild any bridges failed spectacularly. When I tried reaching out to Weston on social media, he blocked me immediately without even reading my messages. My father hung up the phone when I tried calling him. Former friends ignored my attempts to reconnect. Even at the strip club, I was no longer the confident newcomer I'd once been. I was becoming one of the bitter veteran dancers I used to judge when I first started working there. Newer, younger women were joining the roster and taking attention away from me. My earning power was declining, and I was struggling to maintain my position in an industry that values youth and novelty above everything else. The isolation was becoming unbearable, but I refused to admit any of this was my fault. In my mind, I was still the victim of people who couldn't handle my independence and strength. I blamed Weston for being too weak to handle a real woman, my father for being stuck in outdated moral standards, and society for being judgmental about adult entertainment. I convinced myself I was better off without people who couldn't accept my choices, even though I was clearly miserable and alone. Everyone else was moving forward with their lives, while mine remained completely stagnant. I had no real friends, no family support, no romantic prospects, and no future plans beyond making it through each day. The story ends with me alone in the apartment I share with two other dancers, scrolling through social media and watching everyone else's lives progress, while mine stays frozen in place. I tell myself I don't need any of them and that I'm free now. But even I can hear how hollow and unconvincing these affirmations sound. I've lost everything meaningful through my own choices and manipulation, but I'm still too proud and delusional to admit it. I remain completely convinced that the world failed me, not the other way around. This ensures that my isolation will be permanent, because I'll never take responsibility for the decisions that led me here.